So today, basically, I'm going to be attempting to debunk Ben Shapiro and other conservatives with regards to their views about transgenderism. So, in order to do that, we'll first start off with listening to his viewpoints on the topic, and I think his are pretty representative of other conservative figures and their views. So,
how do you say that some people don't have privilege when you basically just said that trans people aren't valid? They're not a thing. They're just girls pretending to be boys or boys pretending to be girls.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, someone's excited. Okay.
Biological, but gender is a completely different thing.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex. So.
It's not completely disconnected, but it's still a cultural thing. It's still from society.
Okay. No, it is not in the mind. Okay, you're not a man if you think you're a man. And I didn't say pretending, or if I did, I shouldn't have said pretending. Let me amend.
You said playing.
Okay, I said a boy who thinks he's a girl. That's the usual phraseology I use. Not playing. I usually say a boy who thinks he's a girl or a girl who thinks he's a boy, which is technically what we're talking about here. As far as the actual psychological issues at play, it used to be called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. Now they call it gender dysphoria. The idea that sex or gender are malleable is not true. Okay, and I'm not denying your humanity if you're a transgender person. I am saying that you are not the sex to which you claim to be. You're still a human being, and you're a human being with an issue that I wish you Godspeed in dealing with in whatever way you see fit. But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are. I think it's egregious. I think that biology is biology. It's amazing to me that people who proclaim that they are scientists are so willing to overlook basic biology and proclaim that people who are fully biologically male can magically become biologically female. We're not talking about people who are intersex. I always like when people who debate this issue immediately go to the marginal issues where their actual is blurring of the lines. People who are intersex or they have some genetic condition, they have Klinefelter syndrome or something, right? That's not what we're talking about here. The actual argument of the transgender civil rights movement is that people who are fully male can actually become fully female. That is obvious nonsense. It's obviously nonsense.
Unfortunately for Ben, today we are not in
basic biology.
We are in advanced biology, so get ready. Also, as a side note, I had to slow that video down to edit it because this guy literally says like 10 words a second. Also, I think it's interesting how conservatives selectively choose when to invoke science. But let's get back into the video. I think in order to understand some of the topics later in this video, we need to understand some
basic biology.
I think one basic principle that we need to understand is how the genetic code actually manifests itself. Genes are made of DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is transcribed into RNA. Messenger RNA molecules then leave the nucleus. They are then translated into protein by the ribosome. Messenger RNA consists of 4 different nitrogenous bases. The sequence of bases in the messenger RNA reflects the sequence of bases in the DNA. In protein-coding genes, a sequence of 3 bases is called a codon. A codon codes for a particular amino acid. Proteins are strings of amino acids. Proteins perform a diverse array of functions within the cell. These functions can include controlling gene expression or catalyzing chemical reactions, among many other functions. In eukaryotic organisms like humans, protein-coding genes are divided into exons and introns. DNA is first transcribed into pre-mRNA. Introns are spliced out and exons are spliced together to form the mature mRNA. The process of alternative splicing is performed by an RNA protein complex called the spliceosome. The inclusion or exclusion of different exons in a mature mRNA transcript allows for many different proteins to be made from a single gene. The genome refers to all the DNA sequence that encodes an organism. The exome refers to all the exons in the genome. Recently, scientists sequenced the exomes of transgender individuals and compared them to those of cisgender individuals. They found 21 sequence variants in 19 protein coding genes that are associated with transgender identity. More specifically, in genes known to be associated with pathways involved in sexually dimorphic brain development. One brain region that has been shown to undergo sexually dimorphic brain development in rodents is the medial preoptic area. And as you can see, the human brain also has a medial preoptic area. Somewhat counterintuitively, during early embryonic development in the medial preoptic area, estrogen signaling leads to masculinization and defeminization of this brain region. First, testosterone is aromatized into estrogen. This is accomplished by an enzyme called aromatase, which is present in medial preoptic neurons. Presumably through estrogen receptor-mediated signaling, estrogen upregulates the expression of cyclooxygenase enzymes, which thereby increases the biosynthesis of prostaglandin E2. Prostaglandin E2 then binds to G protein-coupled receptors in the membranes of astrocytes and neurons. Prostaglandin E2 binding to receptors in neurons leads to activation of adenylyl cyclase, which thereby increases the intracellular concentration of cyclic AMP. Increase in the concentration of cyclic adenosine monophosphate leads to the activation of protein kinase A. Protein kinase A activation leads to downstream signaling that ultimately leads to the maintenance of AMP-A glutamate receptors in the dendritic spines of medial preoptic neurons. Prostaglandin E2 receptor binding in astrocytes ultimately leads to the release of glutamate, which thereby binds to AMP-A glutamate receptors, which ultimately leads to the formation and maintenance of new dendritic spines in medial preoptic neurons. This process of masculinization and defeminization of the medial preoptic area that was just described is required for male-specific sexual behaviors such as mounting and intromission. If this developmental cascade of events does not occur, feminization of this brain region occurs. If a female rat is exposed to estradiol or AMP-A receptor agonists during a critical window in early development, that female will exhibit male-specific sexual behaviors such as mounting in adulthood. This is because the process of masculinization and defeminization of the preoptic nucleus was initiated artificially. Interestingly, one of the mutations that was found to be associated with transgender identity was in the gene encoding sphingosine kinase 1. Targeting of sphingosine kinase 1 mRNA using RNA interference leads to a reduction in the incorporation of radioactive acetyl groups in COX-2. In case you forgot, COX-2 or cyclooxygenase 2 is an enzyme involved in the biosynthesis of prostaglandin E2. And again, prostaglandin E2 biosynthesis is required for the masculinization and defeminization of the preoptic nucleus in the brain. Acetylation of COX-2 by aspirin leads to an inhibition of prostaglandin biosynthesis, and again, sphingosine kinase 1 promotes acetylation of COX-2. Thus, sphingosine kinase 1 interacts with the pathway required for masculinization and defeminization of the preoptic nucleus. And again, the gene encoding sphingosine kinase 1 was found to be associated with transgender identity. In this paper, the authors also mention many other mutations that affect sexually dimorphic brain development in this brain region and in other brain regions, and I encourage you to read the paper for yourself. And again, those mutations were also associated with transgender identity. In theory, these mutations could disrupt sexually dimorphic brain development in various parts of the brain, potentially leading to masculinization or feminization of various brain regions that is in incongruence with the development of the rest of the body. However, it should be noted that the functional implications of these mutations have not been tested to my knowledge. Doing the sorts of experiments that would be required to figure that out on humans would be not only extremely unethical, but also impractical. For similar reasons, much of our knowledge regarding sexually dimorphic brain development in mammals is restricted to model organisms such as rodents. Considering that much of the anatomy of and many of the genes of rodents are conserved between them and humans, it is likely that the process of masculinization or the process of feminization of the rodent brain is similar to that of humans as well. I think that an interesting experiment would be to take some of these mutations that were identified in transgender individuals and recreate them in rat or mouse models, and to observe whether they were associated with any behavioral changes. If this has already been done or is in the process of being done, someone please let me know. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information, so now it's time for the too long didn't listen section. Some main points. Humans are mammals. Various parts of the mammalian brain get masculinized or feminized during early development. In theory, environmental agents, epigenetic factors, or genetic factors could disrupt the sexualization of the brain. The brain is a sex organ controlling behavior. My claim, transgender individuals have brains that have at least partially undergone the developmental pathway of the sex which they claim to be, thus they are at least partially the sex which they claim to be. If this is the case, you would not be able to tell by just overtly looking at someone. Now let's look back at Ben Shapiro's thoughts on the matter.
I think it's egregious. I think that biology is biology. It's amazing to me that people who proclaim that they are scientists are so willing to overlook basic biology and proclaim that people who are fully biologically male can magically become biologically female. Okay, and I'm not denying your humanity if you're a transgender person. I am saying that you are not the sex to which you claim to be. The people who are fully biologically male.
Ben Shapiro's claim: transgender women are fully biologically male. Transgender men are fully biologically female. Trans people are not the sex to which they claim to be. Distillation of the biological literature. It is theoretically possible that someone's brain could be sexualized in a manner opposite of the rest of the body. There is growing evidence that this is the case in transgender individuals.